We already covered exposure, but I want to talk about it in more detail. Let us travel from Ohio to Paris, France, and visit the Louvre for a detailed explanation of exposure considerations. This is the pyramid at the Louvre Museum, which is the world's largest art museum and a historic monument in the center of Paris, France. This is a sunny summer day around 10 a.m. and it's a perfect place to talk about exposure. First, I want to zoom out a bit, all the way to 24 millimeters, which is a common wide-angle focal length. You can see based on the crop of the video that I was shooting at around 85 millimeters. Now let's slow this way down and take a picture. This is perfect. So we have a very typical image based on a sunny day. This actually correlates to the sunny 16 rule, which is how photographers used to base their exposure decisions. Essentially, the sunny 16 rule dictates that on a bright and sunny day with clear, distinct shadows, the f-stop should be set at f16 and the shutter speed should be set to align with your ISO choice. This essentially guarantees a good exposure of your scene. So here, I chose ISO 100 because I wanted the lowest amount of noise possible in the image. The closest full-stop shutter speed is 1/125th of a second, and the f-stop was left at f16, which will pretty much keep everything in focus since I'm using a wide-angle focal length. That is the position of the light meter indicator. It is positioned directly underneath the 0 mark, which indicates a normal or correct exposure. We're not going to get into the debate of subjective choice of exposure. So for now, let's just say a normal exposure is what most closely approximates the true scene as we see it. Notice how the light meter goes to the right to +3 stops, which indicates overexposure, and goes to -3 stops on the left side, which indicates underexposure. So I want to run a series of under and overexposed images in this experiment. I will keep the ISO locked at 100 and the f-stop at f16. The only variable that I'm going to change is the shutter speed. Obviously, you can over or underexpose an image with the f-stop and the ISO, but again, we're just going to change the shutter speed. By shooting at 1/250th of a second, this shot is underexposed by -1 stop. I would suggest this is actually a better exposure of the sky, but you do start to lose detail in the buildings and the people. This shot was taken at 1/500th of a second. Notice how the light meter indicates that this is -2 stops underexposed. Again, I like the exposure of the sky, but now the buildings and the people are more of a silhouette. This shot was taken at 1/1000th of a second at 3 stops underexposed from the normal exposure. Now remember, shutter speed control for both motion and movement as well as light and exposure. Here, I am using shutter speed mainly as an exposure control. This shot was taken at 1/2000th of a second and is definitely starting to look underexposed. Most light meters do not go past ±3 stops. So if your image is more than 3 stops over or under, typically most cameras will let the light meter go to the far one side or the other, and it will blink rapidly to indicate that it's severely over or underexposed. Just to prove the point, this shot was taken at 1/4000th of a second. And this shot was taken at 1/8000th of a second. Clearly it is very underexposed. Let's go back to the correct exposure of 1/25th of a second at f16 at ISO 100, which again is a perfect sunny 16 rule example. Now let us start overexposing this scene in full stop shutter speed increments. This is 1/60th of a second, 1 stop overexposed. Notice the buildings and the people look better, but now the sky looks a little too bright. The details are blown out. This is 1/30th of a second, 2 full stops overexposed. My camera is locked down on a tripod, so I can go lower than a 60th of a second for these images. And since the buildings were pretty much in total shadow based on the position of the sun, this is probably the brightest image of the buildings to showcase their detail. But notice the sky is really blown out now, as are the bricks on the ground. This is the consideration of exposure when you have scenes that are drastically different from the very brightest areas of the scene to the very darkest areas of the scene. Okay, this shot was taken at 1/15th of a second, and it's just wildly overexposed. Notice the light meter is pointing at the +3 mark, which indicates 3 stops of overexposure. Just for your reference, I'm going to continue overexposing the scene a bit more. This is 1/4 of a second. This is 1/2 of a second. And this is 1 full second at f16 at ISO 100. So I have essentially ran through the entire shutter speed scale from 1 second to 1/8,000th of a second. Here they are all together. Depending on what's most important to you in this scene is ultimately going to decide which is the best exposure for you to communicate your idea. Whenever I get in a challenging exposure situation or I'm at some historic or important scene to me, I always bracket my shots. That means I take several shots at normal exposure, and then I'll take a few shots a little over, a little under, just to ensure I have the best exposure possible or have many options later when editing. If I could only take one shot of this scene, I would most likely choose the camera meter suggestion of f16 at 1/125th of a second and ISO 100. This seems to be the best balance between keeping the buildings a little bright but not overexposing the sky. Because I know in Photoshop, I can darken down the sky a little and I can still brighten up the buildings a little without having to push either area too far. Let's go over to Photoshop now. Okay, so let's start with Adobe Bridge, and I've selected the image that we've been discussing that had the most normal exposure to work with. Now, since it's a RAW file, again by the file extension .cr2, you know it was taken from a Canon camera, and as soon as I double click on it, it's going to open up the RAW processing engine, reset all the defaults. So here's what the shot actually looked like as it came out of the camera. The sky is a little overexposed, and the buildings which were in shadow based on the position of the sun are underexposed. So what do we need to do? We need to pull down the exposure in the sky. So I'm going to do that with the highlights and the white slider. And I need to raise the exposure value in the shadows. So I'm going to start out with the shadow slider and try to raise that up. That's already looking much better. I'm going to push the clarity just a touch. I'm going to raise the vibrance and make that blue sky a little bluer. And already, I think it's looking much better. So I'm going to click Open Image, hit Command 0 to fill the screen with it. I like this change that we've made, but let's push it a bit further. First, I'm going to duplicate the layer by hitting Command J. That'll be Control J for Windows users. And what would I like to do even more of? Well, I'd like to further brighten and increase the contrast of the building foreground scene. I'm going to do that by getting the quick selection tool, hit the right bracket key to make my brush a little bigger, and then I'm just going to quickly select the building foreground area. I'm going to click Select and Mask. Why don't I feather that just a touch? Choose Output Settings, and I'm going to go with a layer mask. So notice what I've done. If I turn this off, the background layer, essentially you can see where I've masked off everything that's not the sky, which is great. So that means all my adjustments are happening only on the foreground, and I'll rename it just for ease. Now that I'm on this layer, I'm going to choose Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and now I'm just going to work specifically on this bottom part. So I'm going to again brighten that up, maybe raise the exposure a bit, and now it looks like it doesn't have any blacks. So I'm going to pull the blacks down a bit, pull the whites down. Maybe that exposure is a little too high. See if I can warm up that foreground just a little bit. Then I want to hit OK. Remember, what we're looking at now is after my original first pass at the Photoshop RAW filter. And then I added a second Photoshop RAW filter with a mask just to the foreground, which I think definitely spices it up. This should be more white here. So I'm going to hit Command J to duplicate the layer, and I'm going to drag the mask to the trash. And it's going to say, do I want to apply that mask first or not? And I'm going to say no, just delete it, because I want to add my own mask. I'm going to choose the polygonal lasso tool, and I'm going to select just the pyramid. So you can see I've just selected the pyramid, which is where I want to make the adjustment. So I'm going to go back to this layer and hit Command J. Okay, so let's just make this a little whiter. So looking at the levels dialog box, you can see there is no rich black or dark tones in the image. There is no rich white or light tones. So I need to compress that histogram in order to get the kind of look that I'm going for. Now let's turn on the other. See how I've given more prominence to the pyramid, which is almost the focus of it, of the whole shot. I'm going to go back into the camera raw filter just for this one thing, and I'm going to brighten that exposure up a little. Let's see what that looks like. Now it looks like the Louvre is glowing. So maybe I should just make it a little more subtle by fading the opacity. Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E, and that compressed every layer up to the very top layer. If I turn all these off by holding on the Option key and clicking on the eyeball, this is the layer, and here's where we started after our first adjustment. So I'm going to title this first, as in the first revision, first R. I'm going to Command J it, and call this second R. Because now let's make it a black and white image. I can do that by going down to this half chocolate, half vanilla cookie looking symbol to create a new fill or adjustment layer. You can see it's converted everything to black and white, and it looks kind of gray, kind of washed out. But the interesting thing is this is all based on color channel information, which means anything that's red, I can make brighter. Anything that's red, I can make darker. So I can affect the luminance value of the color channel, which gives me very specific control over my black and white conversion. So let's slide that up a bit because I want those buildings to be a little brighter. Those buildings were yellow as well, so make that a little brighter. I would say that the sky could be a little darker, more like Ansel Adams. So I'll pull down the blues and cyans and see how already we're getting a lot of drama in this image just from this one tweak of adjustment. So I'm gonna say that's good. I'll hit Shift Command Option the letter E, compress all that to the top layer, and I'm just gonna delete this black and white layer because now this is the actual black and white. I'm gonna pull this down one, and I'm back to this second revision here a little bit. So what I'd like to do for this shot is to show you how to make a fake HDR. Because typically an HDR image is composited from multiple images taken at normal exposure, way overexposure, and way underexposure. In that other Photoshop video that's after this, I'll go into much more detail of all of these processes. Okay, so there's a nice fake HDR. So let's look at what we've done. I've restructured my layers panel so that you can see the original one we started with. Here's the original shot, straight out of camera. So here's my first raw adjustment. Now notice the difference. Basically, I just opened up the shadow detail a bit, and I pulled down the highlight detail in the sky a bit, and a little bit of saturation. My second attempt to further brighten that building and foreground area, just so it pops a bit more. And then here's my next revision where I focused on the pyramid at the Louvre. I mean, that's the strong point of the image. So I want to showcase that. And then here's the black and white conversion, and here's the fake HDR. So now that we've done all that, I think the only thing left is I believe it should be cropped. So I can hit the C key or choose the crop tool, and it's a real balance. Kind of like the square format that's presenting that we could go to Instagram with. And if I include this one person because I want some of that building, that gives the Louvre a position of rule of thirds, which is nice. But I think telling the story for this particular shot, I'm going to go with the tourist photographing her friend. I'll pull this down just a touch and hit enter. And so now let's look at all the images. Started here. This is after the crop. There's my first raw adjustment, which is subtle. That's my second pass at making the foreground buildings and people brighter. Here's making the pyramid a bit brighter. Here's a black and white conversion. And here's a fake HDR. You guys get to learn how to do all of this in a very detailed explanation of the process in the second video. Make sure you watch it. Remember, whenever learning new things, I always recommend to just take what applies to you and use it, and everything else that doesn't apply, leave it behind. You will know what tips and techniques personally resonate with your style of image making. As an artist and as a photographer, you need to trust your intuition. First, I want to zoom out a bit. 24 millimeters, which is a common wide angle focal length. Something's not right. Okay, I got it. I don't know why I'm so, but I can't the screen in my head. Right. Yeah. Now, we will get into the debate of subjective choice of exposure. Yeah, I was making it up. Again, most light meters go past stick. No, that's me. That was all me. Oh, you think so?